there's just some issues about mobility and so forth that he's not going to be with us. But we are very, very delighted to have Brother Melvin Curry here. There's so much I want to say about him personally. Just to tell you the kind of relationship we have. My freshman year, I didn't go to the spring banquet, and he was the MC. And so at one point during the banquet, he got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed an announcement. Our dear friend Shane Scott has been in a terrible accident today. He was run over by a steamroller. And if you want to visit him in the hospital, he's in rooms 221 through 237. So that's the kind of personal relationship that we have. And I think we're all very aware of his wonderful academic accomplishments as a longtime professor here and head of the Bible department. But more than anything else, our brother loves the Lord, and he wants other people to come to know him. Right. And it's just a great pleasure to get to listen to him today and to spend time with him. So, Brother Curry, I turn the floor over to you.
You want to help?
Yeah, I know.
Well, how much of this do you want to listen to? I'm going to make a presentation, and then I'll try and field some questions. And I've asked Jason Longstreth, if he will, to take care of that for me, because I don't know why, but I'm having trouble seeing and hearing and eating and smelling. And standing and walking. But other than that, I'm really doing great. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm glad that I'm able to do this, and I'm very sorry that Bob is not here, because I'm a teacher, Bob's a preacher. And I don't mean to make a technical distinction in that. It's like a sliding scale of one or the other. And he would probably have a lot of insight that I won't be able to share with you, but I'll do my best with what I have. Thus far, by God's grace, I have been able to preach from March the 4th, 1951, to November the 13th, 2022, which was the last sermon that I have preached, which really is a little over 71 years. And I want to say that I'm glad that there's such a young audience here. Really, I'm thankful that there's still some people alive that can listen to me. I've been able to help some people in my life, but others I failed, I hindered, I disappointed, I insulted, I hurt, and I even angered. And for some of that, I'm sorry, not for all of it. Because there are times in which what you say is going to anger people, whether you want to or not. I think the thing that I hate the worst is that I have insulted some people unintentionally. I have this inclination to use a lot of irony. And it just comes out. I don't know. My mother was this way, so I think I probably have it in my genes. And so I may say the opposite to you that I'm really attempting to say. So please take it as a compliment and not otherwise. But by God's grace, I've been able to have just unbelievable experiences through the year. And to Him be the glory through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. because he is the one who has made it possible for any of us to do the work of preaching. I'm going to follow some notes and speak for a few minutes, and then we'll try and have some questions. I was born during the Depression, but I was very fortunate in that my father had a steady job where businesses were closing down, service stations in particular. He was in the business with the Standard Oil Company of putting them in mothballs, and then when the Depression was over, opening them up. And we didn't really miss too much of a beat. But most of my kinfolks did. They were poor dirt farmers up in Mississippi, and they just couldn't scratch enough to make a living. And there were times in which there was a large group of the family down in our house just simply to survive. When you grow up in a situation like that, you don't expect much, and that's a good thing. This is such an affluent society that we can't even imagine it. And that has a hindrance to the preaching of the gospel. The immorality that is so rampant in the world today is awful. I don't know that I ever expected to see it in my lifetime. Oh, I've read about it in previous generations. I've had a great deal of study in classics and followed the downfall of the Greeks and the Romans. And it's exactly the same pattern. You know, people may look a little bit different and dress a little different, but we're all the same. And we have to recognize that fact. We're blessed, and we need to use those blessings in the service of God. There was a great optimism following the Second World War. The wars had been won in the East and the West with great sacrifice and loss of life. But victory was accomplished. And people were just enthusiastic about life. And this, of course, bled over into the church of our Lord Jesus Christ. There was this desire to do good because so much evil had been experienced. And especially, Christians wanted to do good work. And that was even more true of those who were veterans. When I came to Florida College in 1949, each year, as a freshman and a sophomore, I had veterans as roommates. They had both served actively in the military and on the front lines. And I heard tales that I couldn't believe. They were so awful. And I have known individuals that were on the front lines in the Korean War. When I graduated from high school, I had a choice. I could either go to Korea or go to college. And I chose to go to college. Through my life, I have not been a total conscientious objector, but I inherited that heritage from the previous generation. And I have declared that I would be a non-combatant. And that's the way I registered with the government. I was telling that to a man who had fought on the front during the Second World War, and he listened patiently to what I had to say. And I said, my own philosophy is, I will not take a life for my country, but I will give my life for my country. He said, wait till you get on the front lines. He said, I don't think you know what you'll do, and I agreed with that. Now, I tell you that simply so you'll know the perspective that I'm coming from. Floyd Wallace Jr. almost single-handedly changed the attitude of brethren on the war question. He just took it as a personal duty to do this. It's a deep matter of conscience, and those of us that were close to the Second World War respected conscience. And I'm going into this because I want you to understand that brethren have always had differences. And some of them come to the point that you just cannot continue to coexist. But that should be the last resort. And I'm not talking about compromise. I'm talking about respecting an individual's convictions. And especially the right of an individual to have convictions on matters that we refer to as expedience. Money was not any kind of an issue for most people. Frankly, they didn't have any. They knew that one would need to work at a second job in order to preach. And few congregations could afford what we now refer to as a full-time preacher, which is not a biblical term. You're either a student and a teacher of God's Word, or really you're not a Christian. No matter how simple it may be, it can be simply the example of your life. That's the best kind of teaching. Churches with funds, and there were large congregations in those days, were looking for seasoned preachers. They didn't want somebody, fresh out of kindergarten. And so most of the preaching that was done in rural churches. And they really, really did need the preaching. Why did I become a preacher? Well, I didn't intend to. I came to FC, and after fiddling around a good bit, finally settled into a major in science. And then I began to reflect. Preaching was important to my parents. Especially my mother's side of the family had a heritage. They told me stories when I was a boy, my grandparents on my mother's side, about keeping J.D. Tant when he was there for a meeting, about so many others that were of that generation. And the stories thrilled me, really, as a boy, of the sacrifice that these individuals made to preach God's Word. Also, I had begun to reflect on the direction that my life was going. It was the wrong way. I was one of the most polished hypocrites that the world ever knew, and I could hide it very well to most people. And I was pretty wild when I was young. because that's the way it was in high school. There weren't any young people, particularly my age, as Christians, and so I kind of had to go it alone, like many of you have done. I had been immersed when I was about 12 years old. And it really never was a very serious matter. It was done, and I can remember this because it was the thing to do. And so at the end of my freshman year, I was baptized. And it made a change in my life, obviously. And I was greatly encouraged to preach the gospel. I was encouraged by family and by faculty and by students and my roommates in particular, and all of the veterans that were students at that time. It was a small college, and there was just a host of veterans that were coming on the GI Bill in order to study. In fact, that was one of the chief reasons for the beginning of Florida College, to provide these men possibility of an education. And this encouragement was just absolutely important and life-changing. And I was beginning to get serious about getting married. I had seen this girl and had been going with her, and I mean, wow, I was just smitten. And eventually it did happen, and she has put up with me for about 70 and a half years now, and has been my great role model through life. And then there was the interest in the Bible. I have always just had a deep interest in studying the Bible. And it does not go away. And frankly, I'm very glad that at this stage in life, I have through the years been able to gather enough tools to be able to make a whole lot more sense than I used to, and try my best to use that to the glory of God. My first sermon was preached up north of Dade City, not too far away, in a community called Chillicothe, right at the intersection of Highway 301 and 575. On the left-hand side of the street, there was a two-story house. And there were two sisters that were trying to get a college started. They were very diligent in what they were doing, very serious about it. And there were only two of them. I was invited up and encouraged, especially by a young man who went with me by the name of Tommy Kelton. We called him TK. And he went up and he led singing, and he led the prayer. And in fact, he officiated the Lord's Supper, and I preached. So I had worked real hard on a sermon. Well, that is to find one in a sermon outline book, which I finally did. In Leroy Brownlow's book entitled Seed for the Sword, just very short ideas for the most part about sermons. And from that day till this, I have a very special proverb that is most dear to me. Stolen waters are sweet. I read the text of the sermon, "What is that in thine hand?" From Exodus chapter 4 and verse 2. And I read the context of it. And when I looked up, both of the women were asleep. This is a true story. Some of mine aren't, but this one is. They stayed asleep until I had given the invitation, and TK stood up and started leading the singing, and they started singing like nothing had ever happened. Afterwards, they split the contribution with me, and I got $3. The next Lord's Day, I preached at Pine Castle over near Orlando, my home. And then I came back to Chillicothe, and that time they weren't too well pleased with what they had heard, being asleep. And so they cut my salary by $1, so I got $2. Now, I don't really mean to make light of that. I mean, as I said before, money was really hard to come by. And frankly, if you think about it in this day and age, and I understand that there's 10% inflation, it's hard for me to really believe that, but having to try to get along on as little as we did. But that would have been $20 a piece. I happened to pass the collection plate last Lord's Day, and I heard some change put in. One fellow, like Martin Luther, talk about the money clinking in the container. I saw several people pull out a dollar bill. That is just almost blasphemous. Now, I only say that, and I certainly wouldn't identify people, because I know them, and I know that they're sitting there with sophisticated telephones and computers and driving pretty nice cars, and it's just regularly a dollar bill. I know people that have given $20 for all of their life and never have increased their contribution. Okay, that's my first sermon. But I was just amazed at the support then that I was given. Just in rapid succession, I preached at Pine Castle, again at Chillicothe, at Temple Terrace, and St. Cloud, Sweetwater, Cork, Apopka, Opelika, 7th Avenue in Miami, Holden Heights in Orlando, Lutz, Lake Wales, Winter Garden. Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. I don't think I even missed a Sunday after I first started preaching, and didn't for years, because people were open and receptive and helpful with regard to the preaching of the gospel. I've just been blessed. I've been able to preach in 26 states of the United States, 18 east of the Mississippi and 8 west of the Mississippi, and mostly for small churches under 75 members, some few between 100 and 150, and several that were quite large, but the record attendance I think that I ever had was out on a cow pasture in Ethiopia, where there were probably about 800 people in a drizzly rain, sitting there with their Bibles open, just mesmerized and taking notes on the classes. And when we got through after 8 hours, they held their hands up, which is to say, please don't stop. I took a picture where there was a boy who had finally found a place to squeeze in and sit, and right between his feet was a fresh cow pile. Now I want you to let that sink in. Most people don't have what we have. But I tell you what, they're willing to walk an entire day barefooted in order to come hear the gospel preached. To me, just to experience something like that one time has made preaching worth everything. And then there was my first gospel meeting. Grandview, Missouri, which really was the most exciting work that I have to say I was ever involved in. It was still 1954, not that long since the war was over, and there was this enthusiasm within the group to evangelize. But I was substituting on a radio program for Bill Humble, who had been teaching here, and he was really the reason that I went out in that area. There was a church that swarmed out of the old 39th and Flora congregation, formed down in Grandview. And it was way up in north Missouri, almost to the line of Iowa. I really don't even have a record of what that congregation was or any of the sermons that I preached there. It was just a church building way out by itself, cornfields all around it, but it was wintertime, extremely cold. And I wonder, where in the world is anybody coming from out here? But when the meeting started, I think it started on Monday night and went through Sunday, if I remember correctly. I tell you what, the building was full, and literally people were standing around the sides and in the back. And I thought, wow, this is something. And so I really gave it as much as I could, and a young girl came forward to be baptized. And I looked around, and, it was like this. There was no opening in the floor, and there was nothing behind except a solid wall. And I said, well, where's the baptistry? And they said, well, Brother Curry said, we'll take care of that in the morning. So early in the morning, we all got up and got a procession going and went out into the cornfield through the snow. And I thought, where in the world are we going? Because they didn't tell me. And they said, okay, we're here. And I saw a little dip in the snow. And it was a pond. Now, I want you to know, I'm from Florida. And I had never even seen snow until just a few months before that. And even then, didn't even recognize what it was at first. It was up along the fence lines. And so I had to take my shoes off and go out and rake the snow away. And I found the ice on the pond. And I took my hands and I broke the ice. And I made a hole big enough to get down in. Now, I'm beginning to get a little cold by now. And so I would break a piece of ice, and then I would slide it back over the top, and then I'd break another. And I finally made the baptistry. And I came up, and I got the young girl's hand to take her down into the water and take her confession. They said, Brother Curry, we usually extend an invitation song. And hypocritically, I was saying, oh, I hope nobody responds. Not really. And sure enough, a young man decided that he wanted to be baptized. So I took the confessions through chattering teeth, and then I took the young woman down in and baptized her, led her back out, took the young man and led him back out. And when I got out finally, they threw a blanket over me, carried me up to the farmhouse, and just pointed me to the bathroom. I've never experienced anything like that. So what did I do? What I would do at home. I filled the bathtub full of hot water and got in. And I'm telling you what, I thought my feet were going to throb off. it was some sight because I was laying in that tub with my feet up in the air holding them and gradually thawed out enough until I could really warm up. Now, I tell you those two stories just to help you understand that the things were a little primitive back in those days for most of us. I spent most of the time out of the cities and not within the cities. And also, as I began that first time, I continued to preach, and it really has just been a great blessing. As I said, and I'm going to bring this to a conclusion pretty quickly, the work in Grandview, Missouri was really the one that I look back to as the finest hour in many respects. It was a new group. We were meeting in a rented hall. There was a tremendous enthusiasm. We went through building a building and a deep concern for evangelizing the area. There was a congregation in North Kansas City that owned a tent. And when they weren't using the tent, we would be using it. So we would go out and scout out a community in another little town where there was no congregation and go out and put the tent up in the city park, usually, and just start preaching. In those days, meetings just were not shorter than 2 weeks, usually 3 weeks. And some of the tent meetings would extend longer than that. You would just stay until there were enough people to start a congregation. And that wasn't an exceptional thing. That was a very ordinary thing that was done. And there are congregations in that area that began because of the work of the brothers and sisters in Grandview. But, this euphoria didn't last too long. This was a period of time in which the institutional problem had really already pretty well been settled. But at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s is when the sponsoring church arrangements began to be engaged in. Brethren had gone overseas and they had seen the condition and the hunger of people for the gospel. And they began to realize, well, one congregation just can't do this. If we can just find some way for the congregations to work together and, not be a missionary society, then that's the way to do it. And so in 1943, G.C. Brewer announced that the Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas was going to sponsor, and that's the word that he used, the work in Europe. And call on other churches to send them money in order to get this work done. And that became the fashion, actually. And it was effective. I mean, there were really a lot of people that were converted through those efforts. And then also, there began to develop at that time a sponsoring church radio program called the Herald of Truth. And about December or October the 31st in 1954, James Nichols came to Kansas City to the Van Brunt Church and was preaching for a week, and he gave a report on the Herald of Truth. Now, one of the things the Herald of Truth was doing, and I suppose they still do, when they would make a contact with someone in your area, then they would send you the information and there would be a follow-up. And a number of people were converted in the Grandview area as a result of the Herald of Truth radio program being the initial contact. Well, a little while later, December the 10th, Otis Gatewood came. And he was the one that had been chosen by Broadway to really spearhead the work over in Germany. And he gave a report at the Van Brunt Church. It was really a large congregation and progressive, as they would say today. I really prefer to say digressive. And he, of course, gave glowing reports of the work in Europe, and he wasn't exaggerating. I mean, it was true. Well, there were people in the congregation that had really come out of a different background than I had come out of. And they began to want to do these things, to engage in them, especially the Herald of Truth. And more, it began to be a problem. We didn't have any elders, and I began to notice that some older men, really men that could be elders, began to come to the congregation in Grandview from Van Brunt. I didn't think about it at the time, but as I look back on it, it sure seems to me that they were infiltrating the congregation. And two of these men did become elders in the church, and the die was cast at that particular point. I was really in a turmoil. I'd begun to do some graduate work by that time, and I decided I wanted to go the direction of teaching. I was really discouraged, frankly. I never have been pushy and just tried to reason with people, but it just wasn't working. And I really angered people because back in January the 5th, 1956, I wrote this in the bulletin. Some Christians seem to be wondering why anyone would question the Herald of Truth radio and television work. They think that the only ones that are concerned with the organization of this good work and the preaching of the Word is a good work are just a few hobby writers. Such is far from being the case. There are great men of repute on either side of the question, while others who are sincerely seeking the truth on the matter are unsettled in their conclusions thus far. Most of us respect and revere Brother C.R. Nickel, a man who has been called on by the Brotherhood to defend truth against error in the past years more than any other old soldier among us, unless it be Brother W. Curtis Porter. We quote the following account from a write-up about the recent Abilene debate on the Herald of Truth issue between Brother E.R. Harper, and Brother Yater Tant. Now, I won't read the whole thing, but it was like I exploded a bomb in the congregation. Not too long after that, I tendered a resignation, and really the die was set for me to go prepare myself for teaching. I wasn't going to give up preaching. I was just going to change the direction from full-time to part-time as far as preaching was concerned. You know, in a sense, I was running from the problem because I didn't want to divide a church. Now, I'm not throwing stones at anyone. Those were extremely difficult times. I was struggling, and I went down to Harding College to to get an accredited bachelor's degree. I had an unaccredited one from Florida College because accreditation had come in the interim. And I got a job at an ice cream factory, and another student from Harding was there, and both of us loaded the trucks at night. And he was the son-in-law of the man who was dean of the academy at Harding College. And I had talked to Jack Lewis, a professor at Harding College, about wanting to go on in the study of Hebrew. And one night I got this call, and a brother said, I'm an elder at the church in Covington, Kentucky, and you were recommended by Brother Jack Lewis, and we'd like for you to come up. And he told me all the arrangements that were to be made, the train I was to catch, and who was going to pick me up, where I was going to stay, and so on. And I was pretty excited because, my direction in life now was focused. Because Hebrew Union was right across the river in Cincinnati, and Jack Lewis had done the same thing. So I was pretty excited, and at the end of the conversation, he said, I think this is totally unnecessary, but he said, it's just routine. I want to ask you a question. I said, well, sure, what? He said, what is your position on orphans' homes? And I thought, uh-oh, here it is. I said, well, that's a broad subject. What do you mean by orphans' home? I said, people can take orphans into their home. A congregation, in case the parents are killed, can care for a child in its midst or more children. And then there are homes that are operated by a single congregation that others send funds to, a sponsoring church. And then there are just the institutional organizations. And he said, well, which one would you not accept? So I fiddled around and finally said, Bowles Home. And he said, I need to talk to the other elder. And he said, I'll call you tomorrow night. And I said, the other fellow, he said, what in the world was that all about? So I told him, and I said, I wish I'd really saved the man his call. And he said, oh, surely not. He said, this is not going to be a problem. 15 minutes later, I got a call. Brother Curry, we better not go through with this. I said, I fully understand. But please, Jack Lewis didn't even know what I believed about things like this, so I really respect him for making the recommendation. And I went in the next day and I talked to Brother Lewis. He said, you have some problem with orphans' homes? And we had a friendly talk about it. Now, why have I taken this time? I had run from a problem, but I had to face it, and I had to make a decision on the spur of the moment. I've never looked back. Okay, questions? Yeah.
In Ephesians 4, Christ gave gifts to men, which included evangelists, pastors, and teachers for the equipping of the saints. And one of the work that I see of a preacher is to equip the saints. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders in every church. And I sort of see that that's being overlooked by evangelists, is the appointment of elders in every church. And it's difficult for preachers to go to preach full-time in a congregation that does not have elders. I'd just like to get your ideas on that.
Well, my ideas are probably the same as yours. I mean, it's a difficult situation. But it's to be expected. I mean, if you look at the qualifications for elders and you look around in the congregation, you either exist without elders or you disband. And there really isn't an option in that regard. So struggle with it, deal with it. I don't have a good answer for it. Hopefully men can be developed. And I think we can almost be hobby riders on a few things to try and keep them from being selected. But I tell you what, the worst thing in the world that you can do is have a congregation with bad elders. You are in trouble when that happens.
Question by the door? Yeah. Brother Curry, could you recommend what are one or two of the most valuable books you've read or owned besides your Bible?
Recommending books, is that what he's saying?
One or two the best besides your Bible. What would you recommend?
Well, my third sermon was preached at the Temple Terrace congregation in the wing which has been torn down of Sutton Hall. It's not Sutton Hall anymore. What is it? Heinley, who was a member of the congregation that I was from in Orlando. But the wing was a library, and so they would move the tables out and put chairs up, and that's where the Temple Terrace congregation actually met, having that arrangement with the school. My third sermon, I'd gotten $3, I'd gotten $5 at Pine Castle. They gave me a check or cash for $40. I thought the world had come to an end. So I went out and I bought a Bible, I bought a suit of clothes, and I bought McKnight's epistles of Paul, and I was in business then. But I don't know. One of the books that very much impressed me when I was young was the book on the Great Commission by, I've got to think here for a minute. I think J.W. McGarvey, but I'm not sure about that. It was very helpful to me. And I'm struggling here. Who did the commentary on Romans? That's from the who?
Lard. Who else?
Lard, yeah, Moses E. Lard. I thought that was a really good commentary because in those days, people argued with each other, and I mean argue in the sense of present arguments freely. You know, if you were a Methodist, you knew why you were a Methodist, and you were ready to defend Methodism, or, you know, a Baptist or a Presbyterian. And that's not true these days. You know, it's all top water for the most part. And so I found his commentary on Romans to be exceptional. I don't know, books are very personal in that regard. I think the best thing in the whole area of just world views is Edward J. Carnell's a Christian, a Christian philosophy. That's enough of it. I can't say it exactly. I mean, it's a little difficult. He tries to make it as simple as possible, but I'll tell you what, everybody ought to read that. I think that, I'm going to give you a little rule, and it's not original with me. It actually was written by C.S. Lewis in a little essay on books. For every new book you read 2 old ones. Now, you can go to some websites of books of the Restoration Movement, and you can download nearly all of these books. Anything earlier than 1925, you can download. I have probably thousands of books downloaded, and especially of the Restoration Movement. And you need to saturate yourself in some of the older works. And I don't mean just by brethren. There's a difference today. There's a whole different approach. Some of it's good, a lot of it's bad. Some of it I agree with, a lot of it I don't agree with. But every generation has to struggle, with its contemporary environment, and you're no different. It's hard for me to give you advice, and because frankly, it's lonely out there. Please understand that. In the final analysis, you are you, and you are by yourself, and you have to make your own decisions. Books are important, but for every book you read the Bible 10 times. 10 times. Because ultimately, it really doesn't make it what any man says. It's what God says. Well, I can't understand it. Well, do you think the people back in New Testament times could understand it? Could the Philippians understand the letter Paul sent them? Could the people in Rome understand the book of Romans? We say, oh, it's so difficult. Well, it really isn't that difficult. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they wrote to the people of that day and age. You can understand it. You have to struggle to understand it, but you can understand it. There used to be a saying about a judge that was holding a trial, and they couldn't find the Bible for people to swear in on, that they used to do. Put your hand, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? And so they were desperate, and so finally he said, write down the block. He said, his brother Smith, he said, why don't you go down there and get him, and we'll just lay our hands on his head, because he's full of the Bible. I met a man in Ethiopia. Oh, I wish I could have spoken his language and talked with him at length, riding a mule, a stately-looking old gentleman. And the thing that was told me about him is that he has memorized the New Testament. I'm not sure he could read or write.
I think we'll need to cut it off there. That's the hardest thing to do. The ladies' lecture is starting in 5 minutes. But, we needed to book this for 2 or 3 hours. Appreciate so much you being here. I want to thank Brother Craig. I'll be taking up a collection that I'm going to split with him.
Yeah.